Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
that looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
With something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Political, legal, and faith leaders have been increasingly criticizing the ICE and Border Patrol raids and tactics. Law enforcement officials are joining in those criticisms. In this edition of Challenge 2.0, we speak with a retired prosecutor and a retired police chief, both with decades of experience in the Puget Sound area. They contend the methods used by federal agents to impose law and order may actually increase lawlessness and disorder. So on this very timely and difficult topic, we're very fortunate to have two guests with great depth of experience in this field. John Ladenburg, who is a retired Pierce County prosecutor and also Pierce County executive. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure.
I should mention that we linked up via one of the social media sites, and he very graciously said, yeah, I'll do this. And Bonnie Bowers, retired Anacortes police chief, and also a graduate of the FBI National Academy. So Bonnie, thank you so much for making the drive down. And you're still in Anacortes right now, right?
Still in Anacortes.
Well, when they started showing the coverage, either on TV or newspaper, of the ICE and Border Patrol raids and arrests, from a personal level, what were your reactions? John, I might ask you that question first.
Well, originally when it all started up and you see little media stuff, I didn't pay a lot of attention, mainly because I've been in law enforcement and a lot of it is misrepresented by media, not intentionally, because there's complex things going on that they perhaps don't know. So I don't pay a lot of attention. But as it wore on and as some of the videos came out, I looked at a few of them and I was just kind of amazed at the incompetence of how things were being handled by agents, officers on the scene. And I got concerned about it because having been in law enforcement a long time and having still relatives in law enforcement, I was concerned that the whole reputation of law enforcement is dependent on citizens believing in law enforcement. And I saw that starting to slip away. And I'm very concerned, and even greater concern now after several months of this. So it's been an escalation in the problems I see.
Bonnie, how about you?
A really similar answer. I was sad and I was angered. First of all, it's arresting people as they come in and detaining them for their hearings. They're showing up for court when they're supposed to show up for court on a civil matter, immigration, and arresting them in the courthouse. It's not done. It's very unprofessional. And why would you keep going to court if you thought you were going to show up and be deported as other people have been? Right. So we're breaking an already very damaged process there. And then as things progressed, the lack of due process that was happening was incredible, and the tactics of the law enforcement agents. And I struggle with ICE being a law enforcement agency. It's a different type of law. It's a federal civil law, not the criminal law that you and I are used to enforcing. But the tactics were not representative of what you'd see in American law enforcement.
How does one of the things that struck me is that you have a certain level of coordination, I would think, between federal agents and local, be it city, county, or state. How does, I should say, based on your experience of how that worked when you were a police chief, when you were a prosecutor, a county executive, how does what we're seeing now differ from what was your experience when you were in the jobs that you held?
It's radically different what ICE is doing, and that's one of the concerns also, is that there appears, and from what I hear from law enforcement in those agencies, there is no coordination, not bad coordination, no coordination, which is very, very dangerous, very dangerous. You have people, who are, in military gear, masked, and brandishing weapons, and that's a real concern of mine. Is that Law enforcement doesn't do that. You don't ride around with a AK-47 hanging out the window. You don't point your gun at people unless you have a reason to point your gun at people, and it better be a good reason. You don't even pull your weapon from its holster, a handgun, unless you're under some threat that you need to pull. You see videos of them stopping cars and jumping out with weapons pointed at the car without knowing who's in the car. That is radically different than responsible law enforcement, and it leads to issues like we've seen, people getting shot that very unprofessional actions lead up to it, and by officers, I don't think they're properly trained. I mean, the appearances are not properly trained. And you have to recall that ICE suddenly went from an agency where they wore uniforms, but they didn't wear tactical vests, they didn't carry obvious weapons, and they were informing, civil judgments. They were going out in that manner and didn't appear at all threatening to the public. Now it's just the opposite. It all appears threatening. And what's the public reaction? We're seeing, a very outpouring of the public demanding that this change, that this not be it, because that's not how they want law enforcement to be enforced. And the problem is it's hurting all of law enforcement, not just ICE. And a real reformation needs to take place.
When you see smashing of windows, they're just pulling somebody over, and without even giving a chance to talk, they're smashing the windows just to talk to somebody. Bonnie, what about your experience in terms of that sort of coordination?
The tactics they're using is so foreign to anyone, especially in Washington State law enforcement. A police officer who's hired goes through a rigorous background process and polygraph examination and different psychological evaluations. So by the time you're hired, you've vetted your candidates pretty well. And then they go to the training academy, which is, I think, 14 weeks still. And then they have a field training officer for a prescribed period of time and probationary status for a year in most agencies. So there's not the hiring accelerated training that ICE is going through right now and putting those people on the street. And more than that, when we do a significant raid, and I don't call them raids, but if we had a critical incident in our community that was going to require us to make an at-risk arrest situation, we deconflicted it with the other agencies. So if I was going into the city of Mount Vernon with my SWAT team to make an arrest, we would let them know ahead of time, we would coordinate with them, we would plan ahead of them. One of the things that really disturbed me that, you see these little snippets on the news now was a school bus was in front of an apartment complex loading children while ICE was doing a raid at that apartment complex. That doesn't happen necessarily in local law enforcement unless there is exigent circumstances, someone's life at risk. And again, normally these are civil crimes. That really bothers me. The other thing that they're asking the ICE agents to do is respond to civil disobedience or legal protests that are happening by citizens. So when you put officers in that kind of situations, there is training ahead of how you handle a crowd, a protest. I recall back at WTO in Seattle, and even in the Millennium, we trained for a couple days each on how to respond to crowds. And what I'm seeing, the way they verbally bait folks that are protesting is not professional. It's Bush League, and it wouldn't be done here. It's disrespectful of their rights, first of all. And one of the things that we talk about when we train young police officers is when you're dealing with civil disobedience, part of your job is to protect the rights, the civil liberties of those protesters for their freedom of speech, their freedom of assembly. So when you become the problem rather than the solution to the problem, that is disturbing.
John,
they're inciting the crowd. You see that. Lots of videos of them, like she said, arguing with the crowd. Trained officers don't do that. You have a way of handling crowds. But I suspect, part of the problem is you take a bunch of ICE officers from last year who were just doing their job like I mentioned earlier, and suddenly throw them into a position of now you're an armed agent with tactical vests in front of a crowd and masks. They have no experience doing this, none at all. The fact that they were ICE officers is irrelevant. They say, oh, this ICE officer has 6 years experience. I said, with crowd control? I don't think so.
Right.
With stopping violence, and gathering evidence. I don't think so. And in fact, you see from the videos, they're doing just the opposite. They're destroying evidence, they're hiding evidence, they're creating the problems. You have the most recent killing there where they have a guy on the ground, an officer on the guy, and the officer standing behind him pulls his weapon.
Yeah.
And when I saw the video, as soon as he did, I went, why is he pulling his weapon?
Right.
You don't take your weapon out to even threaten to use deadly force unless you're in danger of deadly force or serious bodily injury. Now, can anybody argue that that officer standing there behind him was in danger of serious bodily injury or death? I don't think so. I think you put that in front of a jury, they're going to go, no, there's no reason to be pulling your weapon. And then he shoots and kills the guy.
Yeah.
There's nothing to say that anything there was being done by a professional law enforcement officer that had any experience in that matter. I mean, I've gone to the academy. I've gone through the shoot, don't shoot videos and training. They go through a lot of scenarios to tell you when you have the right to do that and when you should do that with weapons. You don't see that in this case. You see agents running around with their weapons drawn for no apparent reason. The prior shooting at a car that's moving, getting in front of a car that's. I can give you 10 things that agent who shot and killed that woman did that no trained officer would do. Or if he did even one of them, would be reprimanded for doing it right afterwards. So you don't get in front of a moving vehicle. You never shoot at a vehicle. You don't shoot at moving vehicles. You don't shoot into a vehicle unless you know everybody who's in that vehicle. He had no idea. There could have been children in the back seat of that vehicle. There's just all kinds of reasons to look at those things and go, wow, this is way outside the bounds of normal law enforcement. And as prosecutor, I investigated. We had a protocol where we investigate every officer involved shooting, the prosecutor's office. I had investigators on staff, and I've actually gone to the scenes of those things to do a proper investigation of officer-involved shootings. You don't see any of that going on here, and that's very concerning.
Can I just ask, because I have no background in that, but when you are looking at a candidate to be a police officer, I imagine you're looking a little bit at a psychological profile, their orientation, their experience, their emotional maturity. What sort of standards did you have for that, and do you have a sense that they're almost looking for an exact opposite of that as they hire new ICE agents? And I guess there's a big hiring push that's going on right now.
There's not a lot of transparency with their hiring process right now. If you go to the ICE website, you can see what their steps are, but there isn't anything that shows that they're actually doing that. And in a psychological profile, you can gauge someone's aggressiveness. And so when you are hiring for a small town like I come from, we look for someone who sees themselves as a guardian that is there to protect and serve those folks, not somebody who wants to do battle every day, because it's just not going to happen, right? And certainly the point that John made about the agency for police to do their job comes from the people. That goes back to Sir Robert Peel, and constantly you reinforce with young officers, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And I want to go back to the use of force for a minute, because I see things from a different lens a little bit than a prosecutor. I have been in those situations where it is frightening and someone's armed. And then looking at that video, what I saw was probably an ICE agent who hadn't been in that situation before. Someone allegedly yelled gun, and so they were looking for a threat, and they were excited, and they were scared, and they made a mistake. Those type of situations, they go for an internal review immediately from an outside agency like a prosecutor's office, depending on the state that you're in. And the fact that that didn't happen and that you had public figures supporting that action, that erodes trust so fast. And that was probably more disappointing. Obviously, that was a mistake. The first shooting with the car, I was actually, obviously like you, if a car is coming towards you and you can get out of the way, get out of the way. Principle of policing and use of force is that you always use the amount of force necessary to make the arrest. If you're arresting a murderer, that's one thing. The probability of using force and deadly force is there. If you are arresting somebody who is at a protest, and is even the civil disobedience that you allege is happening, that use of force is way over the top
Yeah.
and not justifiable, and you can't even call that an accident. That appeared to be a murder.
And John, having been on both sides investigating officer-involved shootings, what's your sense in terms of what you typically would see in police or county sheriff's deputies and what we're seeing with ICE right now in terms of their emotional response, their psychological readiness to be put in these situations?
Well, I agree with the chief, and the ones that I investigated and the officers that I've known over the years, my first reaction in most of the cases was they were too reserved. Mm-hmm. That they actually could have gone to the next level of force earlier than they did. Mm-hmm. And I saw that result in some officers getting shot and killed. And we had a number of officer deaths that I investigated and prosecuted. And in a number of those cases, the officer was so circumspect to get to that next level of pulling his gun or shooting his gun that they end up paying the ultimate price.
Right.
So my attitude kind of starts there. But what I see here is different. There doesn't appear to be any reluctance. It appears to be first choice in many situations. Like I say, they're carrying their guns around in the open for no apparent reason. I mean, there's nothing going on. They jump out of a car with their guns drawn on what appears to be a traffic stop. Mm-hmm. Now, if I see that when I'm on the street, and I've seen that occasionally, you call that a felony stop. That's a felony stop because the officer's got his hand on his gun or pulled his gun as he gets out of the vehicle, meaning he knows who's in the vehicle or likely to be in the vehicle, and it's an armed or dangerous person. Right. They already know that. We don't see that in this situation. And why? Part of it's the attitude. And how do you get that kind of attitude? One of the things that the chief mentioned is we have local officers. Mm-hmm. The best officers are the ones that live in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And so you want to prefer local police officers, hire locally as much as you can. The worst thing to do is like ICE is doing, bring in people from different state. They're not only not part of the community, they're not even part of that state's community. And therefore they feel like invaders or military
an occupiers.
Force. Yeah, an occupying force, exactly. And that changes your attitude. And that's what I think we're seeing here too. It's a huge mistake to do that. ICE didn't used to operate that way. The ICE agents that I knew were local people. Mm-hmm. They lived in the community. They didn't come from New York to come here and arrest somebody. So that's a major mistake in the management of ICE, major mistake, and it's leading to those kind of problems.
The other question I would ask is, you see local law enforcement officials, city police, county sheriff's deputies, state patrol, none of them have masks on. They have very definite uniforms, badges, and that sort of thing. And yet, very often, number one, the masks just seem to be ubiquitous when you see an ICE or Border Patrol agent. But they claim they need that to protect their officers, and yet that doesn't seem necessary on the local standpoint. What's your reaction to that?
For example, in a community like ours, when we would do a drug raid, it was important to protect the identity of those officers who were working for the drug task force, but would be going back onto the streets someday. So yes, they would wear balaclavas on the raids. I know when the high-risk team and the SWAT team go out, they will wear balaclavas, but they are dealing with an armed and dangerous person when they go into that situation, and they know that. So there's a little bit of difference. Even with those folks, one of the principles of Robert Peel back from the 1820s in England was every officer should be identified by a badge. Mm-hmm. And in our situation in Washington State, not only do you have a badge, but you have a name on your uniform. And we're not seeing that. And we're seeing that anonymity and that occupying force come in. And quite honestly, why should the public support that? They don't know those individuals. They're not identified. They're threatening their neighbors. So it's concerning that they're not that they are wearing masks, and I hope that they change their policy on body cameras, because I can tell you in Washington State, when we adopted body cameras, 99.9% of the time, you are seeing your officers do the right thing over and over again.
Interesting.
And for the most part, no officer wants to see a bad officer still on patrol, still out there representing. So the chiefs welcomed that, and the sheriffs. And it has shown time and time again that our officers are professional and doing the right thing.
John, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree. That's been my experience with the cameras too, is that it shows the officers doing their job and doing it well, and it proves some of the circumstances they have to deal with. Two comments about the balaclavas and the mask and the lack of identification. Psychologically, for the person who's put into the ICE agent, it encourages them to do things you wouldn't normally do. And the psychologist will tell you that that's what leads to those kinds of things. Now, the idea that they are in some great danger is nonsense. I've been around for a lot of years. I was a prosecutor. I put people on death row. I personally put people on death row. I got lots of threats. I'm still living in the same home I lived in 40 years ago. Everybody knows where I live. You get miscellaneous threats that are nonsense. As they used to say in law enforcement, it's the one you don't get that's dangerous.
That's
they
right.
don't threaten you.
Yeah.
And so, and same thing with the judges and the jurors and everybody in law enforcement and the court system. It's made up. That's that's TV stuff, frankly. I'm sure the chief and I, we see a TV show, something like that, and we kind of go, yeah, sure. You don't watch a lot of law enforcement stuff because most of it's not true. And so I'm not of any concern that those officers could show their faces and not worry. Secondarily, they're not even from that state. They're not going to go home down the block and be threatened. They're not going to, they'll be gone. So even if you had a picture of them and had their name, how would is there some big conspiracy going to track them down and do something because of one individual officer? That's nonsense. The reason they're wearing the mask and being secret is to make sure that they can be in that mode that they've got them in, paramilitary, acting like routing the crowds. Why would they even be allowed to do crowd control? If I'm doing something in my neighborhood and a big crowd gathers, I can just call the police department and say, control the crowd. That's their job. Why don't they just call the local police and say, we have a crowd here, you do your job? That's the policeman's job, not ICE's job, to confront the people. They're intentionally doing that, and that's very concerning because it's, in my mind, they're committing the crime right there, and somebody needs to be held accountable for this kind of stuff.
Just a very short time, I'm not sure the exact amount of time, after the shooting of Renee Good and then Alex Preddy, I imagine they hadn't even cleared the scene. And you had people from the administration calling them domestic terrorists and assassins. When you would have situations, is that sort of immediate response from official sources unusual, just for one word? And what problems does it cause?
It's unheard of. And first of all, you're going to bias any jury that you might have later by making that comment. It is very hard as a police chief or as a sheriff when you know that an officer has been in an involved shooting and from the evidence you see at the time, it was the right call. You want to support that officer because it's a horrible situation to be in. No officer with their salt is happy to take a human life. That just doesn't happen. Talk about some PTSD. Officers will have that after shootings, contrary to what we might see on the network television show. So you have to, at that point, while being supportive of your officer privately, publicly say, we are going to let this investigation play out. And, at this point, this is not our call, and it is going to go through review before we make any statements like that. And you talk about the tragedy that happened, that a human life was lost, regardless of who it was.
John, in the seat that you were in as a county prosecutor and then also executive, I suspect that would not have been the way you would have responded to that.
Well, it quite literally is not only wrong, it's illegal. In Washington law, a prosecutor could be debarred for making those kind of statements. You're not allowed to do it. There's a reason why we always respond the alleged.
Right.
It's the scales of justice. You don't get to put your thumb on it over here and say he's already guilty. And why would we want that? Or the reason is clear that informs public opinion that the system is not fair. It's not justice. It's predetermined who's going to be guilty and who's going to be innocent. And once you do that, you start affecting all of society, because that's the bedrock of society, as I've said before, is a justice system and a government system that seems fair, that I'm going to get treated fairly by my own government. If I'm not going to be, why should I vote? Why should I be involved? Why should I follow orders of a legal officer? When an officer from Anacortes comes up and says, don't do this, I need this space for, you say, I don't care. I don't believe in you.
Yeah.
And that's the danger. And that's why you don't do it. And it's just terribly inappropriate. And that's why it's so shocking to everybody in law enforcement. They go, what? You don't do that. No one does that.
That brings up all sorts of important points in terms of what the long-range impact is going to be. And I knew we'd have much to talk about. And I thank you both for being willing to stick around for a second part of the conversation, because that's exactly what we want to get into. So thank you so much for appearing on this episode and agreeing to be part of a continuation of this conversation. And thank you, each of you, for tuning into this episode of Challenge 2.0, and hope you'll join us for the rest of this conversation next week. Thank you. If you've enjoyed this program, found the conversations informative, interesting, and thought-provoking, and the visions of people from different backgrounds, faiths, or wisdom traditions inspiring, people who can disagree without being disagreeable and respect the essential human dignity of all, perhaps consider supporting our organization with a contribution. Your donation will not only support this program, but also the broader work of our nonprofit charitable organization, Paths to Understanding. Thank you.